number 707 is found in the hymnals in the racks, and you're going to have to share it.
Would you please be seated?
Reflections on Farming by Wendell Berry. Why do farmers farm, given their economic adversities on top of the many frustrations and difficulties normal to farming? And the answer is always love. They must do it for love. Farmers farm for the love of farming. They love to watch and nurture the plants. They love to live in the presence of animals. They love to work outdoors. They love the weather, maybe even when it's making them miserable. They love to live where they work and work where they live. If the scale of their farming is small enough, they like to work in the company of their children and with the help of their children. They love the measure of independence that farm life can still provide. Wendell Berry.
Good afternoon. The parable of the sower from Matthew chapter 13. On that day, Jesus went out to the house and sat down by the sea. Such a large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd stood along the shore. And he spoke to them at length in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky ground, where it had little soil. It sprang up at once, because the soil was not deep, and when the sun rose, it was scorched, and it withered for lack of roots. Some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it. But some seed fell on rich soil and produced fruit, 100 or 60 or 30-fold. Whoever has ears ought to hear. and the parable of the mustard seed. He proposed another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a person took and sowed into the field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, yet when full grown, it is the largest of plants. It becomes a large bush, and the birds of the sky come and dwell in its branches.
seeds, stories of seeds, and soil and sprouts and good soil and bad. Jesus used such images to teach about God, about love, about community, about producing out of the life that God has given us. Those two parables of Jesus, read for us earlier by Lauren. Scattering of seed that grows depending on the soil, and the size of the seed having no bearing on what is produced as those seeds sprout and grow and are nurtured to produce and provide. Seeds and gardens and planting and harvest were favorite topics of Jesus, because God is in the business of life and growth and creating abundance to provide for us and to sustain all life on this planet. These are all gifts of God, who has created us and all that is, providing abundance. And today's parables are fitting especially for this time of year. Something springing up with life in the spring. And I know that spring is not yet officially here, but in spite of the snow we've had in the last couple of days, we're getting close. We're getting closer to the renewal of life. You can even see the buds swelling on the trees, those things that Dawn knew to watch for, to expect, to anticipate, and share that anticipation with those who needed to know. Spring is not yet officially here, but the promise of new life again, fulfilled in the seeds, is starting to show forth. Those seeds that have lain dormant and invisible in the soil, but not really dead, just waiting for the right time to break forth. Farming was the culture in Jesus' time, and he often used images of seeds and sprouts and gardens and harvests to help people understand the grace of God, the presence of God, the love of God, the provision of God, and God's providence in their lives. It was so much a part of Jesus that there's even a story of him being mistaken for a gardener outside his tomb on the day of his resurrection, on that first Easter morning. Jesus was mistaken for a gardener. And these stories of Jesus and these parables that he teaches are meant to be open-ended. They're not to be taken as literal truth, but to remind us of what is true and right and good in the world, in God's creation. They're an invitation to be, each of us, a productive part of what God is blessing in the world. It's these scriptures that Dawn's family chose to read today. Stories of seeds and fields and gardens and growth and harvest. Because if you knew Dawn, you knew of Dawn's interest in helping others with their efforts and their labors and their experiments. You knew of his love of nature, of his love of growing things, whether in his own garden or the gardens and fields and orchards of others. His love of the wild things found in the mountain meadows and the wilderness of forests and deserts, along those beloved hiking trails he shared with friends and family. The Bible has stories of all of those things that were facets of Dawn's life and his love of life and living life with those he loved. Like those lifeless seeds that take on life in Jesus' stories, we are here because seeds just naturally sprout and grow. That's the way God made things. And the reason we are here may be because Dawn died. But the reason we have come, the reason that brings us here to be together this afternoon, is because Dawn lived. And he helped plant and till and nurture each of us in so many ways. We are here because Dawn made a difference. Dawn was a man of faith, a follower of Christ, a lover of God's creation, a gardener after God's own heart. His life is all about the life and the growth and the seeds and the blossoms and the fruit. and knowing the difference between a sprout that will yield a harvest and a weed that only gets in the way. Those seeds and the farming stories of Jesus should set the context for us gathering here today. It's easy to think that we are here because of death, the death of one who is so dear in so many ways to so many of us. But the reality is we are here because of Don's life. His death determined the time of this gathering, but his life, his love of life, his nurturing of life is why we have come. So as you go from here, when all of this is done and we've had the time downstairs in fellowship around the table, and you make your way back home through the orchards and the fields, maybe some of you eventually the forests and the shrub steppe of our region, think of Don as you see new growth coming, and remember all of the new growth he nurtured in the farms and fields around us and in so many of us here in this room. And give thanks for the good soil that was Don's life, that God tilled in his life, the ways Don applied his love and knowledge and wisdom to till the ground in all of us. We are here because of his death, but death is not our focus. It never should be. Let us focus on and celebrate Don's life, his zest for living, his love for living things. First and foremost for his beloved family, his beloved wife Gwen, his beloved friends gathered in this room, and beyond this room watching on the live stream. 4 sons, their spouses, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. These are the fruit of the seed sown by Don in our lives. And I only had the chance to really know Don marginally for the last year and a half or so, and the privilege of being his pastor for the last 8 months. But there are others here who knew him very well. So I would invite the 4 sons to come forward. Corey, Carrie, David, and Joel, if you would join me up front and share your memories, your words about your father.
So hi, I'm Joel, and if it's not obvious, I'm the youngest of Don's 4 boys. When looking back at the memories of Dad, there are 3 words that come to mind: fair, funny, and friend. Dad was fair. Growing up, he was strict, but how could you not be with 4 boys? But also fair in how he approached discipline and how he did not jump to conclusions about who was to blame when certain situations came up. Like in my teenage years, when I was in high school and the brothers were home one summer from college, we always ate outside in the summer. One evening as we sat down getting ready to eat, Dad walked up the hill from the garden and said calmly, "I don't care who planted the marijuana, but it better be gone by morning." And he walked away. Of course, we all looked at each other, with those not me expressions and surprised looks on our faces, but it was gone by morning. And to this day, nobody has admitted who actually did it, but we know it was Carrie. Dad didn't swear. The worst he would say was "dagnabbit." And we knew that if we swore, you'd have your mouth washed out with soap. I remember one day when I was saying some choice words to either Carrie or David, and I can't remember which. And they said, "You'd better stop because Dad's right behind you." And of course I didn't, because I thought they were lying, because they always lied to me. But sure enough, Dad was there and took me in the bathroom, sink with a bar of soap. But being the fair person he was, as one of the brothers started to laugh, he said, "You get your mouth washed out too." So Dad grabbed him, and we had a dual mouth washing that day. It makes me smile every time I think about it. Dad was really funny. He had a great sense of humor. He loved corny, slightly off-color jokes, and we would always laugh at them, no matter how many times he told them. I can't repeat them here, but it's safe to say there were moles and molehills, as well as planes flying upside down, among other things. My son Blake made the mistake of drawing a picture of that molehill joke in school. Needless to say, the teacher was not too pleased. She was a nun.
Oh,
All these jokes now live on in our families, and we tell them over and over and over, and everybody laughs. Dad also loved to tell stories, and again, he would tell them over and over. But he'd always ask, have I told you the story about? And Mom would roll her eyes and go, oh, Don, yes, they've heard it. And even if we said, yes, Dad, we have heard it, he would tell it anyway. He would often tell these stories at dinner, and Dad was a slow, methodical eater. It would always result in him being the last one to finish. And he'd look around and go, how you guys eat fast. And he'd always say, dag nabbit, I ate too much. Lastly, Dad was my friend. As I grew older, both Mom and Dad transitioned from being parents to being our friends, which is how it should be. I knew this transition was starting during my freshman year at college, when I was walking around with a beer in my hand at WSU, go figure, and was cited for a minor in possession by the Pullman police. I had to call Dad the next day and explain what happened, the amount of the fine, etc. And I was expecting a lecture or at least a few stern words, but all he did was laugh. He laughed really hard. And for me, it was nice because I had a few years alone with Mom and Dad as the brothers moved out on their own. For example, mowing the lawn now went from 2.5 hours of being a slog to a team approach with me mowing and Dad wheeling the grass down on the compost pile. And then we sit on the lawn afterwards and share a beer or two. That first time of sitting with Dad and having that beer was really cool because that never happened during the parenting phase. Like I mentioned, there were obviously a ton of memories about Dad, but these 3 words came to mind when looking back, and having him as my friend was the most important of all.
I'm Dave. I am not the youngest, and I'm not the oldest. I'm in the middle, so I am constantly struggling for attention. And I just don't waste time growing hair. When I was thinking of what I was going to say, the other thing is I'm Dave, not David, unless my mom is mad at me. And she must have been doing the input for the program because I noticed it was David in there. My dad used to take me to high school, and then when I was playing football at YVC, the last thing I always remember hearing from my dad before a game, before a wrestling match, before I was going to go swim in the swimming pool, or before I was going to do anything that required me to focus or required me to do something, was let that tiger out. And it was a sending me off. It could have been at 7:30 in the morning before I went to school, but he was always motivating me to do the best that I could. And as I was thinking about that, that's the biggest thing I remember from my high school and college days, is he was always motivating me to do the best that I can. And I would love to say that I always did the best that I could. But there were days where you just don't. But there was never any recrimination. He didn't look down on you. He didn't say anything. But he was always giving you that motivation. And he was always telling you did a good job, even if inside you're kicking yourself because you weren't, or you hadn't. The next thing I remembered that I was thinking about with Dad is he was always ready for a challenge. He was ready for anything. And if you ask him, he'd be ready to do it. And I've come up with some harebrained ideas over the years. There's a bike route called the Tri-Pass, and that's where you leave out at the Y here, where Highway 12 and Highway 410 meet. And you park there and you ride up Highway 12, and then you go over Cayuse after you go down that big steep hill, and then you go back up to the top of Chinook, and then you go back down again. It's about 110 miles, 120 if you go behind Rimrock Lake. And I said, Dad, the bicycle club's going to ride it, but I want to make sure I can do it. Will you sag for me? Which means you drive behind. And he said, sure, just do it. And so my wife made a big bundle of energy bars and went out on my bike, and we'd ride it, and I'd get to a stop where he was going to fill my water bottles, and he'd say, "Well, those energy bars are good." He ate more than I did. A few years later, I started riding a single speed, it's like the old paperboy bikes we used to ride when we were kids. And I said, "Dad, I want to try it on a single speed too." And he said, "Oh, right, let's go. Are there going to be energy bars?" I said, "I don't know, I'll get some bananas." And then the WSU relays that we did were quite fun. He was really proud of himself because one of the hills on there was, you're climbing up from the Snake up a long hill. I think it was about 7 miles, wasn't it? We called it Stud Horse Hill. And if you ran that leg, you got a little certificate. And the first year we did it, Dad ran that leg, and he was bragging about running up Stud Horse Hill for about a year until we did it again. I don't know if we still have it, but he was really proud of that. Another thing that we did is we did the gap to gap with all 4 of us. And he was really proud. Saw that picture, and he was really proud of that, and it was just fun to do, and he would drop anything and do those events. I remember being invited over to his place one time, well, Mom and Dad's place, and I got there, and he's out digging in the dirt, and I said, "What are you doing, Dad?" And he said, "Oh, we got a leak." And so we started digging and digging. These were 4-foot, and then it became 6-foot holes because we're looking for this leak. Turns out it was that big water tank above their house had overflowed, and it was running down along the pipe. So we didn't need to dig those holes, but he sure enjoyed having me do it. Talked about it all the time. Another time I said, "Dad, I got to move some furniture. Can you come help me?" So he said, "Sure." And we were moving this big couch. Aaron and I have 2 flights of stairs to the top floor. So we had to move a couch down and a couch up, and one was a hide-a-bed. So the darn thing was unfolding on us. Well, the neat thing about that is, that was 20 years ago, and he died when he was 87. So he was 67 at the time, and we were moving that couch, and he was all game to do it, and did a great job. So the last story I have about this is, when I was in Missoula, I went cross-country skiing once, and I called Carrie and said, "Carrie, let's take Dad out cross-country skiing. I think he'll enjoy that." And so Dad said, "Sure, I'll go." And so we got some cross-country skis, and we went up Snoqualmie Pass and parked there, and we saw all these people. "Oh, cool, we're going to follow this trail," not knowing anything. So we went up, and the trail started off all right, and then it started going uphill, and we started going through all these brambles and all these saplings, and we're falling over ourselves. And eventually we get out on this road, and these little kids are skiing past us going up and down the hill. So we decided to go down the hill, and we ended up right where the car was. It was a unique experience. The last thing that I remember about my dad is the way he led people. My dad led people by example. He didn't pound a drum. He didn't stand out and say, "Look at me, I'm the leader, I'm the boss, you need to do what I say." And personally, I don't know what he did day to day at work, but I know that people respected him at work because he led by example. If that meant moving chairs, if that meant getting out there and doing what needed to be done to make something happen, he did it. And I became a teacher, and I was a coach, and I'm a principal now, and I've been a principal for the past 18 years at a few different schools. And watching him lead by example, or just lead by doing what needed to be done, set me on, when I became a principal, to do the right thing with the staffs that I've worked with. And I really learned a lot from my father in terms of learning how to work with people and how to lead with people. And I wish to say I was as good as he is or was, but I'm not, because I know people get mad at me, and I know that I don't always make the right decisions, but I try to make the right decisions the way he would, and I try to lead the way he did. And I wrote down a lot more, but I'm getting close to the end of my 3 minutes, and I currently work at a building where I have a lot of students who have faced a lot of challenges, from the time they're born and from the time I don't see them again because they graduate or they choose another path. But one of the things I learned from my dad was that you need to come back the next day and you need to start the day anew, and that you need to know what the person did, but know that doesn't make the person. Okay? And make sure that you treat the person as though it's a brand new day and a brand new start. That's the way my father treated me, and that's the way I saw him treat other people. And that's what I try to do with my kids at school every day, because they weren't as fortunate to have a father like I had. They weren't as fortunate to have someone to set a role model. They weren't as fortunate to have someone to teach you right from wrong, even though you still did wrong once in a while. But if I can be half the leader or half the adult or half the person that he was, then I'll feel myself lucky.
Hello, I'm Kerry. I'm also a middle child. So, Dave, he's Corey Dean. I'm Kerry Seen. So it's Seen, but Sean is really spelled. My parents got lazy on the naming after we were pretty close together. Dave was talking about the tri-pass. It starts on a Friday. The event starts on a Friday. He called me on a Thursday. He said, "Hey, I'm gonna do the tri-pass tomorrow. Do you want to come?" And my bike's been hanging from the wall of my garage for 20 years. And I said, "I don't think so, Dave." So I knew what that was. So I kind of got into hiking and mountain climbing a little bit when I got out of college. And so I volunteered to do, I'll talk about climbing, because my dad got into it a lot too, mostly half the time because I would drag him into doing stuff along with 1 or 3 or 4 of my brothers. But so I'm going to talk about hiking. I had a big list of stuff I could talk about because I knew I could talk about it, and then I started going through that. That's going to take I have 3 minutes allotted, which I've probably already taken up. But it's if I told the whole list, I'd go into 20. So I kind of pulled a few things out of it. But when we were one of the early things we did with my dad is we lived here in Sela, and we'd kind of look out over and we could see the sagebrush peaks around us, and he'd say, I want to go climb that one over there. And I think my mother urged him to take the kids out of the house so she could have some peace and quiet. But he would take us out there, and one of the things about those sagebrush hikes is he'd always bring a box of Milk Duds, which is an old style candy, and he called them energy pills. So he said, if you get up to that next rock up there, everybody gets an energy pill. If you get to the top, everybody gets an energy pill. So as I always made about those climbing in the sagebrush was energy pills. And after college, we got a little bit, I went over to Boeing and I joined the Boeing Alpine Club and took a climbing class. We got into doing some other stuff. So I sometimes drugged my parents and my miscellaneous brothers up to peaks. But we had one particular time in the mid 80s, we went up to, we scrambled up to Plummer Peak, which was pretty much just a little hike up. But we had the top, a nice flat time, and it was in September, and it just happened to be my parents' wedding anniversary. And my dad, so it was, I think, a couple of sons and their spouses / girlfriends, and my dad had a little tube in his pack when we were hiking up there, and we all got together, sat down, and eating lunch at the summit, and my dad pops out of this tube. He had a red rose for my mother, and I go, man, I didn't know my dad was romantic, but he was. So then I had a couple other. Later on, I think later on in the 80s, we did a couple we climbed up to Mount. I think all 4 of us go to St. Helens. Yeah. We all 4 went to St. Helens, and we went to Mount Daniel, and going up was always kind of a slow slog going up, and then when Dad was saying, we got to go down, and he goes, how are we getting down? And then you see those slide paths there, Dad? You just sit down and you get down. So you have this big snow slope, and it'd take 2 hours to get up, and you could get down in about 30 seconds. And Dad was the last one to go, but he always did it. So he was up for anything. Then we got into the 90s, and we had the bright idea that we were going to do the Wonderland Trail around Mount Rainier, which was it's 90-something miles and about 20,000 feet of elevation gain. And if you do it all at once, it's about 7 to 10 days usually. Some people can do it. If you really go for it, you can do it in less than that. But we decided we didn't want to, we couldn't commit a week to do it, so we did it in over a couple of years. And we have several stories about that. But one particular one, the first night we spent out, we couldn't get one of the organized campsites, so we talked them into letting us have one of the wilderness, the off-trail sites. And we got up in this one place, and we had to go a long ways to get water, and it was right on this creek, and Dad was down there getting water, and he slipped on this slippery rock and fell and bruised his tailbone on the rock, and he could barely walk for after that. So we got back to the tent, and we had our dinner, and that night it was Corey and Andrew and I were with him, and we played cards on. Dad just laid down because he couldn't do anything, and we played cards on his stomach, so he was very welcome to doing that. We had a couple more interesting stories about the Wonderland Trail. We can talk about that later on. I don't have time to do it. One of my later on, we used to do some kind of to get an overnighter. You know, after we got done with the Wonderland, we try and schedule one overnighter backpacking trip a year. And once, Corey and Dad and I went up to Yellow Astra Butte, which is north of Mount Baker up in the North Cascades. And Dad, I don't know if you see that picture. He has a very large overnight pack. But Dad would always take 2 of everything, and he'd take enough food for a week, even if we're going for a night. So he had a big pack, and we were hiking up there, and we met these guys, and that might have been like bear hunting or something like that. But there's this guy and his son, and they were just amazed. They were asking Dad, "How old are you? How big is that pack?" And they wanted to take their picture with him because they were so amazed that a guy that old age could carry something that heavy. And so they took their picture with Dad, and then he was a little ticked off. The rest of the way, that was about halfway to our camp, and the rest of the way to camp, I can't believe that guy was commenting how old he was and wanted to take my picture and stuff like that. So he didn't think that was very nice. But the guy was trying to compliment him, but Dad thought that wasn't a compliment. So, and one of he was 74 at that time. I think my last bigger hike I did with Dad, we went to Snoqualmie Mountain, which was right off a Snoqualmie Pass, and I talked my dad into doing that. Of course, he said, "Yeah, I'll do it." And it's not really a trail up there, but it's considered an easy scramble. But he was almost 78 at the time, and it involved going up this really steep thing. It was basically a dry waterfall, climbing over rocks and roots, and then going up another steep ridge to the top. And we got about halfway up, and I'm going, "What the heck am I doing? My dad's almost 78 years old, and what am I going to do if he falls over one of these rocks and breaks his leg? How am I going to get him down off of here?" And I actually talk him into turning around and going down to an alternate peak, which ended up, I think we ended up gaining about 2,000 feet more than we would have if we were just gone to the top. I found the limit of, I realized my dad was old at that time. So I was afraid I always thought he was invincible. And then that one I was kind of going, what am I going to do if he breaks his leg? So that was one of the last things we do. I had a big long list of stuff we were going to do, but I was going to talk about, didn't have time. But there was stuff like Dad's adventures on the Stuck River. I'm not sure if there's even is a Stuck River, but that's where he always said there was. And going to Fort Simcoe, which is a very exciting. They picnics up at Chinook Pass with the Chaplins, because that was halfway to where my dad's family lived. Cross country skiing at Snoqualmie, as Dave would say, and just meeting for hikes that's in the middle up in the mountains, from going over, and then wading and bumping river with Ann, where we were still dating, and my parents and Joel, and of course more things on the Wonderland Trail. And we ended up doing Father's Day hikes when all of us kids started having kids. We kind of started a tradition of meeting somewhere with a relatively easy trip and doing a Father's Day hike every year. And And my dad got into a group of retired guys after he retired, and they would go once a week, go somewhere in the mountains. And so that's my memories of hiking with my dad.
So I'm Corey, and I'm the oldest. But I quizzed everybody on the way in, and most of them didn't think I was the oldest, I must say that. So I asked to go last because I wanted to be in a position to rebut any of the things that you might have heard. One of the things that goes along with being the oldest is people create stories after you're gone. You know, the oldest has to kind of lay some trails. And the other thing that goes along with being the oldest is you're the most responsible one, usually. And so I came up and timed myself and came up with about 3.5 minutes. And so I'll let you know when the timer starts, but we aren't there yet. Just a couple of comments on what I've already heard. Part of being the oldest means that you go out there and you're kind of full of yourself, and you go swimming, and you even set a record at a pool or something like that, and then along come your brothers and break all your records. I was the first one to take up photography. I was showing everybody the box camera that I used that was my dad's. I'm not sure it was that one, but it was a box camera I took my first pictures of. And then I got a Hanimex Praktika, and I was taking pictures when I was a freshman in high school. And I thought I was quite the photographer. My dad was a photographer. And then along comes Joel, and he's everybody else became a photographer, and Joel's far surpassed me. And then I thought I was quite the hiker because I go out hiking. I was the first one to buy some hiking boots and stuff like that. And then Kerry comes and walks all over, climbs Mount Rainier 20 times. And so I can't even call myself a hiker when I compare myself to him. I do want to give a shout out. You've heard Kerry mention Andrew. Andrew's my son. He was supposed to be up here singing, but he and his whole family are sitting in Bellingham watching this now because they all had illness go through their family. So they weren't able to share this, and I know he's wishing he were here. I'm sure he enjoyed some of the stories about hiking with us. That was fun. I think he really enjoyed, because it's the first time I've heard it, the story about Dad being a romantic, because Andrew and his wife Sarah, now are married of course, but he pulled a similar stunt that I think to try and get her attention, and that was before they were married, and look what happened. So maybe he and Dad had a conversation before that. The other thing I do need to say is that you heard at least one reference to lawn mowing, and you can ask about lawn mowing when you get downstairs. But the only reason Joel even had an experience mowing lawns with Dad is because I showed him how to do it. And I think Joel and I were the only ones that really mowed lawns, because I mowed it until I went to college. Joel mowed it after everyone left. And then I don't know if Dave and Kerry ever mowed a lawn. Cool. And finally, look at my youngest brother there. You do notice that he's the one with hair. And so I think that at least illustrates the virtues of laissez-faire parenting. Okay, Jan, start the timer now. Those are my unscripted remarks. The rest is all scripted. All right. The week after Dad died, Mom and I were going through a box of trinkets he kept. And one of those trinkets was an envelope with about, I'd say, 16 little handwritten notes from his classmates. I ended up figuring out it was from high school. And I wanted to share some of those with you. Some sort of class exercise. They're all anonymous, but I think you're supposed to say something nice about your classmates. They weren't all nice, but most of them are. I'm going to read 4 of them for you. One is, I feel very fortunate in knowing Donnie. He's really an all-round person. He's extremely courteous, neat in appearance, very good looking, a good student, and loads of fun. These are from Sumner High School, by the way, where he went to school. Next, Don Chaplin is a swell neighbor and very friendly. He has a heart of gold, and he's a good sport. I figured out which were girls and which were boys. That was a boy. I think the last 2 are girls. Don Chaplin is a very good-looking boy. He has a good personality and keeps himself very neat. Second time neat was mentioned. He is kind and dependable. And here's number 4. This is a girl too. Donnie is quiet and bashful, but very friendly to people he knows. Also, he is courteous to the girls and is very neatly dressed. For a boy. So I'll share those with the rest of the family at some point. And through the years, I've learned a lot about Dad just by looking at him through other people's eyes, and it's helped me to grow as a person. When we were putting together Dad's obituary, a couple of my brothers observed that they rarely saw Dad raise his voice, even though he had plenty of occasions where he was probably justified in doing so. My reaction was, I've seen Dad raise his voice. You know, as the oldest, I think Dad and I learned together what it meant, you know, for me to grow up, go through adolescence, stretch and break many of the ties that go along with childhood. Dad had a firm hand, and you've heard this from some of the other guys, and he knew where to set boundaries. Ultimately, as we both developed in our respective roles, me as the eldest son and him as a growing father, which we all go through as we raise our children, he led by example, and you've heard that too. Perhaps some of you can relate to my experience after I left home. I grow up, leave home, and then I return home from time to time, and then I find myself regressing to some of the communication patterns and relationships I had when I left home as an 18-year-old. But looking through others' eyes, it helped me to transition into an adult relationship with Dad. It was my wife, Jan, who told me, you know, your dad is one of the kindest, gentlest men I know. Initially, my reaction was, that's not how Dad was growing up. When I was a teenager, but with some time to think about it a bit and a little bit of maturity on my part, I began to see Dad as a kind and gentle friend, and less as the firm hand charged with helping me into adulthood. Jan's observations were reinforced when I noted comments from his work colleagues. They described him as an excellent listener who would deflect praise to others whenever possible. Dad could carry on a conversation with anyone, something I observed many times, and that's a skill that only comes from being a great listener. Those comments I read to you earlier from his high school classmates helps me to complete the picture of the man that I knew only partially when I was a child. As I grew into adulthood, and for the last 50 years or so, one of Dad's greatest gifts to me was he showed me how to be his friend. You've heard the same from the other guys, that they ended up thinking of him as a friend. And I think we attribute that to him. But even as my friendship with Dad evolved during those 50 years, I still live for Dad's approval, right up until the end. He never missed a chance to give it. Dad had a saying that you might hear today from one of the 4 of us if you spend much time around us. And he always delivered it with a thumbs up and a smile. He'd say, it doesn't get any better than this, no matter the circumstances. Like when he was on his back when we were playing, cribbage on his stomach. He said, it didn't, I'm sure he said it that night. We all said it doesn't get any better than this. We didn't hear that quite so much during the last year as he declined. And even in the end, as he was starting to predict his own demise. Instead, what we did see was that same thumbs up and the same smile, and he'd say, it's been a good ride. That's it. Thank you all for coming.
Hello. So I wrote this letter for Grandpa for Christmas, knowing that he might not be around much longer, and I wanted to make sure he knew what he meant to me. Dear Grandpa, Every time someone asks me about how I first got interested in the weather, I tell them about you and your weather radio. You were the one who made me intrigued about the details of the outdoors, which brought me to my degrees in meteorology. And it also feels fitting that I've ended up working with noxious weeds these past 2 years, as it feels connected to the work that you did. I really appreciate all of your old stories and memories and all of your health advice that you've passed down on to me. Some of my favorite memories are of watching your slides and hearing the stories behind each of them. They always kept me awake. I am so grateful that you and Grandma raised my dad and the brothers in the outdoors, because that has been passed down to me. And being connected with the mountains and the forests has made me who I am today. If you ever wondered if anyone was listening to your stories or advice, know that I was, and there's a big part of you in me. I've now become the longest chewer and the slowest eater at the table. I love you, Grandpa. Love, Megan.
We're going to sing again. I invite you to stand as you're able. We're going to sing Morning is Broken. We are all going to sing Morning is Broken. Share the hymnal. It's in page 145. And we're going to repeat the first verse that we get done, because 3 verses is just not enough. Morning has broken like the first morning. Blackbird has spoken like the first bird. Praise for the singing, praise for the morning, praise for them springing fresh from the word. Sweet the rain's new fall, sunlit from heaven, like the first dew fall on the first grass. Praise for the sweetness of the wet garden, sprung in completeness where his feet pass. Mine is the sunlight, mine is the morning, born of the one light, Eden's soft flame. Praise with elation, praise every morning, God's recreation of the new day. My week has broken like the first morning. Blackbird has spoken like the first bird. Praise for the singing, praise for the morning, praise for them springing fresh from the word.
If it's comfortable for you to do so, I invite you to remain standing. And let us pray together. Eternal God, we have been blessed with thanksgiving. We cherish all the seeds planted in us by His love, His life, and His love of life, for all that Don has given us to make us what we are, for that of Him which lives and grows in each of us, and for His memory that we carry with us. We give you thanks. And as now we hold our memories of Don, we ask for your comfort in our loneliness, your strength for our weakness, and we pray for courage to face the future unafraid. Draw those of us who remain in this life closer to one another. Make us faithful to serve one another, and give us to know that peace and joy in the abundant garden of life Jesus brings about in us and for us. We pray these things through Jesus Christ our Lord, who taught us as his followers to pray together the Lord's Prayer. Let us pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. The closing blessing we give to one another. If you'll look in your program there, the Irish blessing is printed at the end of our order of service. Now I would invite us to read this together as our blessing to one another in Don's memory. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face, and rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. One more thing in closing, and that is a closing song. Did you have a word you wanted to share? Okay.
Dad loved to sing, and we had singing time oftentimes when we were kids. And you see some of these pictures, you'll see Dad playing harmonica with his brothers. Whenever they got on the harmonica, first of all, they always sang, "You Are My Sunshine." So Mom just tried to go. Closing song.
Sunshine, you make me happy when skies are gray. You never know how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. The other night, Our gathering now moves downstairs. You're invited to stay to share the stories you carry with you of Don. There is a time of refreshment and fellowship in the fellowship hall right downstairs. If you'll wait till the family is out.